Hello and welcome to the HBM Test and Measurement FAQ video series. I'm Krista Tweed, an Applications Engineer with HBM, and in this video I'm going to provide information on how to open multiple data files in Perception. Many Perception users need to compare data from different recordings. Some have a gold standard or master file to which they need to compare each new data set. Other users need to overlay data from different data sets or do calculations on both data sets and compare the results. It is possible to do all of this and more with Perception. A licensed copy of Perception, as opposed to Perception Free Viewer, can open an unlimited number of recordings. Perception supports a wide variety of data file formats, including PNRF, LRF, NRF, and WFT. If a user is careful with the setup of their hardware, it is very easy to repeat the same analysis on multiple recordings. There are a few Perception key concepts that we need to review. These concepts are important in understanding how to review and compare data from multiple recordings. The first key concept is data sources. When you open a data file in Perception, you place the information in that file into a data source. The Data Source Navigator gives you a nice overview of the data sources currently available. The Data Source Navigator is one of the tabs that is typically docked on the far left side of the Perception window. If you don't see a tab that says Data Sources, go to the Window menu and make sure Data Sources has a checkbox next to it. By default, the Active, Display, Formula, and System data sources are always displayed in the Navigator. You can use the plus signs to expand each data source. For example, if I expand the active data source with a PNRF file open, I will see data from that file. This particular PNRF has two channels named Temp and MP1. The Temp channel is from Recorder A, and MP1 is from Recorder B. Entries in the information sheet are shown in the information group, as well as some general information under the recording information group. The key to being able to compare data from multiple files is to open each PNRF as a new data source. If you double-click on a PNRF file, Perception automatically loads the data from that file into the active data source. In order to have data from multiple files accessible, you will need to open the additional files and place them in a different data source. Using the Load Recording dialog is the easiest way to open additional data files. Select the menu option, File, Load Recording. The dialog shown here opens. The key part of the dialog is at the bottom, where you specify how you want to load the recording. The default selection is as active. This puts the data into the active data source. Since most virtual workbench files are set up to display the active in the active data source in the active display, no other selections are needed. If you are opening an additional PNRF file, you should choose as reference or using file name. The recommended approach would be to use as reference so that any displays you create with that data can be used again with different data. For example, a common requirement for many Perception users is to set up Perception so that they can repeat the same analysis with multiple sets of data. Many labs using Perception have specific types of tests that they repeat frequently. Users want to create a virtual workbench that allows them to overlay data, do analysis, and create a report with data pulled from two PNRF files. The smart way to configure the virtual workbench is using generic data source names rather than specific file names. Perception recognizes data based on its data source path. Two examples are shown here. By setting up analysis such as formulas, displays, and reports with generic data source names, the user loads data into the two data sources and the analysis is performed automatically. If the user creates formulas around a specific file name, then the analysis has to be recreated when a different file that has a different file name is loaded. The final key perception concept is the review sweep display, and it is only important if you record data in sweeps mode. Many perception users record a single sweep acquisition with perception. In a sweeps acquisition, no data is saved until a trigger is received. A trigger tells perception to save one sweep of data. A sweep has a specific length, 500 milliseconds for example, and the user specifies the trigger position within the sweep, 20% for example. In my example, there would be 20% of the sweep length as pre-trigger data and 80% as post-trigger. The time at which the trigger occurs is typically not of interest to the user and varies from one run to the next. That is, the time lapse from when the recording is started until the trigger is received can vary. What the review sweep display does is make it easy to overlay data from multiple sweep recordings by adjusting the time scale of the display so that the trigger is at time equals 0. As you can see in the example shown here, pre-trigger data is shown as negative time, and post-trigger data is shown as positive time. The timescale adjustment is for display purposes only, making it easy to overlay triggered segments from different data sets. There is a separate FAQ video that discusses review sweep and recording displays in detail if you would like more information. Let's walk through an example to see how this works. I am starting with a PNRF file, also called an experiment file, open in Perception. You can see the experiment has the active sheet configured with a display, a user table, and a meter. Formulas have been created to compare the peak of channel MP1 against an overload limit and determine if the data is within limit or overloaded. The meter that is displayed is configured to be green if the result is within limit and red if the result is an overload. Now what I want to do is open another PNRF file and compare the results to this data. I select File, Load Recording, then select the As Reference option and leave the reference name as Reference 1. Select Open to load the data from the file into the Reference 1 data source. You will not see any changes in the perception screen except for a new data source entry. I would like to display channel MP1 from each file overlaid in the active display. I expand the Reference 1 data source until I see channel MP1. I click and drag the channel from the data source's navigator into the top pane of the active display. The signal is added to the pane. It is a bit messy because both traces are the same color. Right-click on the lower MP1 name and select Trace Setup from the menu. At the bottom of the dialog, there is a checkbox, Replace Channel Color With. Click the checkbox and select a different color. Note the source entry in the middle of the dialog. That shows you the data source name of the currently selected trace. This makes it easy for you to know that the lower MP1 in the pane is from the Reference 1 data source. Select OK, and now the two signals are displayed in the same pane. Selecting Ctrl-T on the keyboard places the active cursor at the trigger point. You can click and drag the blue cursor, also called the passive cursor, into the display area. Note that as soon as you click on the cursor, it becomes active. Press the spacebar on the keyboard and the cursor table display opens. Now that both data sets are loaded, you could also create formulas using both traces. If I need to do this a comparison again in the future, I should save a virtual workbench. To do that, go to File, Save Virtual Workbench As, and give the virtual workbench a name. To see how I would use this virtual workbench to redo this analysis in the future, I close Perception and then double-click on the workbench file I created. This is what I see when Perception finishes loading the workbench. There is no data in the display. That is expected. A virtual workbench does not contain data, it only contains setup information. I need to load data into the active and Reference 1 data sources. So I go to File, Load Recording, browse to the folder with the single trigger PNRF files, select single trigger 002, and loaded as active. In the display, I now have data from the active data source displayed. Since the formulas in the workbench are built around the active data source, the user table is now populated with results. Next, I select File Load Recording again, select a different file, and load it as reference 1. I now see a second MP1 trace in the display. If you want to load a different data set into the reference data source, simply select File, Load Recording, and load additional data. As long as the group names, recorder name, and channel names are the same in the PNRF files, you can use this workbench to compare data from as many files as you like. There is no limit to the number of data sources you can open. As long as the same trigger condition was used for the different PNRF files, the data should be nicely overlaid. If you have some data sets that use a different trigger condition, you may need to use the X-shift formula in the formula database to shift one of the traces to lay on top of the other. Don't hesitate to contact HBM if you need support with perception formulas or other features. Perception allows the user to open an unlimited number of data sources. If you need to repeat the analysis with multiple sets of data, build the analysis using generic data sources rather than a specific file name. You do the work to create the analysis once, lay out the displays, create formulas to calculate results, create your report. Save the virtual workbench. To repeat the analysis with new data, simply load the data of interest into the correct data source. All displays, formulas, and reports are immediately updated with the new results. Thanks for watching. If you have questions on perception or any other HBM product, please feel free to contact technical support via phone, email, or the HBM website.